High in the dark mountains of Tennessee, there once lived a family so isolated, so hidden from the world, that their secrets became more dangerous than the wilderness around them. Among these secrets was a truth almost too disturbing to speak aloud, a truth of bloodlines crossing where they never should have, and of one brother whose actions would forever stain the Sullivan name. The year was 1967. While America was roaring with protests, music, and war, in a remote valley untouched by modern eyes, a cabin stood silent. Inside, behind rotting wood and shuttered windows, a family kept a darkness no neighbor dared to question. Generations of choices had led to this point, and one by one, the consequences would come to light. What really happened inside that cabin? And why did it take decades for the truth to fully emerge? Tonight, we open a door that was never meant to be opened. Before we dive deeper into this chilling story, take a second to hit like if you value hidden histories being brought to light. Subscribe so you don't miss future episodes, and share this with someone who loves real stories that reveal the darker corners of American life. Your support helps keep these forgotten truths alive. The mountains of eastern Tennessee rose like ancient walls, their peaks draped in mist and silence. In those ridges lay valleys untouched by progress, where families lived and died unseen, bound by traditions older than memory. In one of these valleys, known locally as the Valley of Shadows, the Sullivan family built their lives far from prying eyes. Their cabin leaned against a hillside, weather-beaten wood hiding stories no outsider could imagine. Thomas Sullivan, the patriarch, was a quiet man in his late 40s. After his closest companion passed 5 years earlier, he raised 4 sons alone, relying on hard labor and stubborn isolation to keep them alive. The eldest, Elijah, stood 19, strong-shouldered and restless. Then came Michael, 16, with a sharper mind but quiet demeanor. Daniel, only 13, remained inquisitive yet fearful. Finally, Timothy, the youngest at 9, clung to childhood with fragile innocence. To neighbors, though neighbors were miles apart, the Sullivan family looked like any struggling household in the mountains, poor, hardworking, and proud. But appearances were fragile masks, and within those walls, silence carried its own kind of weight. Isolation for the Sullivans was no accident. Generations before, their fathers had married cousins, keeping bloodlines tangled and unbroken. Geography shielded them, and pride defended the strange customs that others would have called unacceptable. The hills had stories, whispered in town squares and general stores. People said mountain families lived by rules not recognized by law. Most dismissed it as gossip, but sometimes whispers carried the weight of truth. For the Sullivan boys, schooling was a fragile thread connecting them to the outside world. When Michael began missing days, excuses grew elaborate. He was sick, Elijah said, but his silence carried unease no words could hide. Teachers noticed, though only one truly questioned. Mr. Henry Whitmore, a gray-haired man with patience worn by decades of mountain children, grew concerned. Why did Elijah always answer for his brother, shielding him so tightly? Henry made the trek up the muddy road one late afternoon, the autumn leaves bleeding crimson into the hills. The Sullivan cabin stood as it always had, dark windows, thin smoke, shadows clinging even in daylight. Elijah met him at the door, his posture tense, his words clipped. Michael never appeared. Behind Elijah's shoulder, Henry glimpsed Daniel and Timothy sitting quietly, their eyes darting nervously, as though fearful of speaking. The visit raised more questions than answers. Henry left unsettled, his boots heavy with mud and thoughts. Something in that house was concealed, something pressing, and the silence of the mountains felt suddenly oppressive. Back in town, whispers grew. Some men spoke of Thomas Sullivan's long absences, working odd jobs on distant farms. Without his hand at the cabin, Elijah ruled unchallenged, reshaping the fragile order left by their father. For Thomas, grief had carved him hollow. After losing his companion, he drowned in work and silence, unable or unwilling to see how his eldest son had filled the vacuum of authority with something darker. The Valley of Shadows earned its name not from geography, but from stories that clung to its ridges. Families who withdrew from the world often carried secrets like scars, passed through generations like unwanted heirlooms. The Sullivan's cabin was one such place, quiet, unremarkable, yet humming with unspoken history. The boys bore the weight of it in their faces, in their hushed words, in the way they avoided the outside world. By 1967, while America blazed with protests, music, and war overseas, this valley remained unchanged. Time stalled here. Progress never entered. What lived in those mountains was older than headlines and far more unsettling. And so, the first chapter of the Sullivan family's unraveling began not with shouts or discovery, but with silence. Silence that pressed heavy against the walls, waiting for the world beyond to finally listen. Elijah had always been the strongest of the Sullivan brothers, his broad shoulders and sharp eyes giving him an air of authority. But strength alone didn't explain the way he began controlling their world. After their father slipped further into silence, working long days away from home, Elijah stepped into the void. What began as simple chores and leadership soon twisted into dominance, unchallenged and unquestioned by his younger brothers. Michael, at 16, found himself under Elijah's constant shadow. Where once they shared small laughter by the creek or whispered about leaving the mountains, now Michael's every move seemed dictated by his older brother's watchful glare. Daniel noticed it first. At 13, too young to challenge yet old enough to recognize tension, he watched Elijah silence Michael with a single look. Timothy, the youngest, obeyed without hesitation, clinging to safety in obedience. Inside the cabin, Elijah's voice grew heavier than thunder. He determined when they ate, when they worked, when they spoke, and when silence must fall. Even Thomas, exhausted and detached, yielded to the boy's tightening grip. For the others, resistance wasn't an option. In isolation, power works differently. It isn't earned by words or fairness, but by fear. Elijah understood this instinctively, molding his brother's silence into the bars of a cage. Outside, neighbors rarely saw them together. If one did, it was Elijah speaking. Michael seemed quieter, his posture bent inward, as though carrying a weight no young man should ever bear on his shoulders. The mountains concealed what was happening, but the air in the cabin grew thick. Daniel whispered once to Timothy, asking if things felt strange. Elijah overheard, and Daniel bore bruises hidden under his sleeves for days. Michael's absence from school became harder to explain. Elijah spun lies with confidence, weaving tales of sickness and farm work. Yet even those who believed sensed an undertone, that the Sullivan cabin guarded something unspeakable. By autumn, Michael had withdrawn almost entirely. He barely ventured beyond the yard. His once bright eyes dulled, and he followed Elijah's commands with mechanical precision, as if resistance had long since drained from his soul. Thomas noticed, but only in fleeting glimpses. He mistook it for grief, hardship, the wear of poverty. His own sorrow clouded him. Perhaps he feared what deeper truths might reveal if he truly looked. Elijah, emboldened by this blindness, grew reckless. He silenced questions before they could form. His brothers lived under unspoken rules, each day heavier than the last. In the Valley of Shadows, shadows themselves were becoming chains. Daniel tried once to confide in a passing farmhand, but Elijah caught him. That night, words turned to fists, and the message was clear. The cabin's secrets would never leave the mountain, not through Daniel. Timothy, too young to understand entirely, learned obedience as survival. He clung to Elijah for protection, confusing fear with loyalty. In his small world, Elijah was both shield and threat, a paradox he could never resolve. Meanwhile, Michael's health worsened. Neighbors who glimpsed him noticed his weight dropping, his clothes hanging looser, his silence deeper. But Elijah's explanations flowed smooth as creek water, always just enough to quiet suspicion, never enough to stop it. Control became ritual. Every meal, every chore, every glance passed through Elijah's authority. His grip wasn't merely physical, it was psychological, weaving guilt and fear into bonds his brothers could neither untangle nor escape. The Valley of Shadows grew colder as winter approached, but inside the Sullivan cabin, something colder still took root. Elijah's dominance wasn't just survival, it was transformation, reshaping the fragile family into something darker, unrecognizable. And yet, as silence tightened around the brothers, whispers began to stir beyond the mountains. Outsiders might have dismissed gossip before, but soon, questions would grow louder. Elijah's grip was strong, but it could not last forever. The first crack in Elijah's silence came not from within the cabin, but from the outside world. Concern grew in town, where Michael's absence from school became too glaring for excuses to explain. Mr. Henry Whitmore, the teacher who had long worried about the Sullivan boys, decided one rainy October afternoon to see the family again. His steps along the muddy road felt heavier than ever. The cabin looked almost lifeless when Henry arrived, smoke barely curling from the chimney. Elijah met him at the door, his jaw tight, his words clipped. Michael was nowhere in sight, despite repeated questions. But Henry caught something Elijah couldn't hide. Michael's shape, visible through a crack in the curtain. He was pale, thinner, his posture withdrawn. When Henry tried to step inside, Elijah blocked the door completely. Suspicion hardened into dread. Henry returned to town, unsettled by what he had seen. The next day, he contacted Sheriff John Caldwell, a veteran lawman who had spent his life in the county's darkest corners. Caldwell knew mountain families kept secrets, but something about Henry's account stirred unease. With decades of experience, he had learned to trust instincts, and his instincts told him the Sullivan cabin hid more than hardship. The following morning, Caldwell saddled up and rode out. Mist hung thick across the valley, swallowing sound. As he approached, the Sullivan cabin stood silent, as though bracing itself against intrusion it could no longer prevent. Inside, he found Michael slumped in a chair, his body frail, his eyes clouded with fear. Daniel and Timothy stood nearby, silent, avoiding the sheriff's gaze, while Elijah hovered like a looming shadow. The sheriff's questions cut through the room. Elijah insisted Michael had been sick for months. But when Caldwell pressed harder, the youngest, Timothy, let slip words his older brother never wanted heard. "It's Elijah. He made him." The words shattered the silence. Elijah's face stiffened, but it was too late. Caldwell's eyes narrowed, understanding dawning. Something more than sickness weighed on Michael, and it was tied directly to Elijah's control. Caldwell ordered Michael to come with him, but Elijah resisted, his stance defiant. Years of authority inside the cabin clashed with the sheriff's hardened authority of the law. For a moment, the room was still. Finally, Michael rose, trembling, his eyes fixed on the floor. Caldwell placed a steadying hand on his shoulder, guiding him outside. Elijah's glare followed them, sharp as a blade, but powerless against the sheriff's presence. Back in town, Michael was examined by a local medic, an aging veteran named Dr. William Thornton. The signs were unmistakable: malnourishment, exhaustion, and scars suggesting more than just physical sickness. Secrets had become visible on his body. Thornton, who had studied medicine in Baltimore, recognized deeper implications. The Sullivan family's long history of isolation and tangled bloodlines showed in Michael's fragile health, a disturbing reflection of generations living far removed from society's safeguards. The discovery sent ripples through the community. Whispers turned into conversations, conversations into outrage. The Sullivan cabin, once dismissed as just another poor homestead, now stood as the center of a gathering storm. Back in the valley, Elijah's grip began to falter. For the first time, outsiders had breached his control, seen what lay inside. The silence he had woven so carefully was beginning to unravel. But the discovery of Michael's suffering was only the beginning. The questions raised in town, in the sheriff's office, and in the doctor's clinic would soon reach deeper, exposing truths darker than anyone was prepared for. And as winter crept closer, the Valley of Shadows would no longer be able to hide the weight of its secrets. The discovery was only the first crack. The collapse was yet to come. Sheriff Caldwell wasted no time after escorting Michael into town. He gathered his deputies, the county doctor, and a court clerk, determined that the Sullivan case would be investigated thoroughly, without deference to mountain traditions. The interrogation began with Thomas, the weary patriarch. His voice cracked with denial, insisting nothing unusual had happened. But his vacant eyes betrayed more than ignorance. They revealed a man worn thin, too broken to intervene. Caldwell then turned his focus to Elijah. The 19-year-old's defiance filled the room like smoke. He spoke of family rules and mountain ways, insisting outsiders couldn't possibly understand. But beneath his bravado, fear lingered. Dr. Thornton examined not just Michael, but Daniel and Timothy as well. Signs of neglect appeared everywhere: undernourishment, developmental delays, and subtle abnormalities, suggesting generations of interwoven bloodlines. Thornton's notes grew darker with every observation he made. The doctor's conclusion was damning. The Sullivan family was suffering from the compounded weight of isolation and inbreeding. Michael's weakened body, Timothy's cognitive difficulties, and Daniel's poor vision all painted a disturbing genetic portrait. Caldwell submitted the evidence to the district attorney, Richard Bennett. Bennett, a stern man with little patience for excuses, faced a dilemma: prosecute Elijah as a criminal, or frame the case as cultural tragedy. The county courthouse buzzed with speculation. Mountain families had always lived by different codes, but this case felt different. Here was proof that silence and secrecy could produce devastation far beyond whispers and rumor. Michael, though frail, gave testimony. His words carried the weight of years lived under Elijah's control. He described how fear dictated every action, how defiance brought punishment, and how silence became the only survival. Daniel corroborated parts of the story, though his voice shook. He admitted Elijah threatened him whenever he tried to speak out. Timothy, too young to explain fully, muttered fragments that painted Elijah as both protector and tormentor. Thornton presented his medical findings in court, speaking in plain terms for the jury. Generations of consanguinity create vulnerability. These boys are not merely victims of circumstance. They are victims of choices repeated across decades. Elijah sat through it all, jaw clenched, eyes burning with resentment. His bravado faltered when evidence piled against him. For the first time, the boy who ruled his brothers found himself stripped of power. Thomas, meanwhile, faced his own charges, neglect and complicity. Though his mind seemed dulled, possibly by the same lineage afflictions, the law could not overlook his failure to protect his sons from Elijah's tightening grip. The community wrestled with the revelations. Some argued it wasn't fair to punish men raised in isolation, taught strange traditions as normal. Others insisted law must intervene wherever harm was found, no matter the mountains. Reporters trickled in from nearby towns. They wrote of the valley that time forgot, sensationalizing the Sullivan story for readers far removed from mountain life. The case quickly became both tragedy and spectacle. For the Sullivan brothers, though, it was no spectacle. It was their lives unraveling in public. Michael avoided crowds, Daniel clung to routine, and Timothy struggled to adapt as his world expanded beyond the cabin. The courtroom air thickened with tension when Caldwell himself testified. "I've seen violence, poverty, and crime in these hills, but this was different. This was silence weaponized. This was family turned into prison." As the gavel echoed, the investigation reached its conclusion. Elijah would stand trial. Thomas would face judgment. And the Sullivan legacy, once hidden deep within the Valley of Shadows, now stood exposed before the world. Yet the investigation, as damning as it was, only marked the halfway point. Ahead waited trials, sentences, and the dismantling of a family shackled by its past. The fall of the cabin had only begun. The trial of Elijah Sullivan drew curious crowds from across the county. People who had once whispered about the Valley of Shadows now sat in wooden benches, waiting to hear the fate of its eldest son. Judge Arthur Blackwood presided with stern gravity. He reminded the courtroom that traditions, however old, could never excuse harm. "Culture cannot be a shield," he declared, setting the tone for proceedings that would shake the valley. The prosecution painted Elijah as both manipulator and oppressor, a young man who twisted silence into chains. Testimonies from his brothers showed how fear had become daily law within the cabin's shadowed walls. Michael spoke quietly, voice cracking, but his words carried unmistakable truth. "We lived how Elijah said we lived. If he told us not to speak, we didn't. If he punished us, we endured." Daniel, trembling but resolute, echoed the account. His eyes shifted often toward Elijah, but courage pushed through. "He said outsiders wanted to destroy us. He told us only he could protect our family." Timothy, too young to form lengthy statements, nodded silently when asked about Elijah's threats. His small frame and nervous fidgeting spoke louder than words, capturing the jury's sympathy and deepening the community's outrage. Defense attorneys attempted to argue cultural misunderstanding, portraying Elijah as a product of isolation rather than malice. Yet even they could not disguise the damage done. Too many scars, visible and hidden, testified to deliberate control. After days of testimony, the jury deliberated. The cabin's silence had been shattered in court, its secrets dragged into daylight. Finally, Elijah Sullivan was sentenced to 15 years in state prison for his actions. The decision divided opinions. Some felt justice had been served, others believed harsher punishment was deserved. Yet for the mountain community, the verdict marked an undeniable shift. The law had penetrated even the Valley of Shadows. Thomas Sullivan faced judgment next. Recognized as negligent rather than malicious, he received a suspended sentence. Yet the court stripped him of custody, deeming him unfit to raise Daniel and Timothy any longer. The cabin that once echoed with commands and fearful silence grew empty. Its walls, weathered by generations, now stood hollow. For the first time in decades, no fire burned within its stone hearth. Daniel and Timothy were placed in temporary homes. The adjustment proved brutal. New rules, new people, new ways of living. Timothy especially struggled, his confusion and limitations leaving him overwhelmed by the outside world. Michael, though older, required careful support. His body was frail, and his mind carried wounds no medicine could heal. Doctors urged rest and counseling, but the boy seemed adrift, tethered to memories of the cabin. Reporters who once flocked to the trial left, but the Sullivans remained, their lives permanently fractured. In quiet corners of town, people still whispered, their voices mixing pity, disgust, and reluctant recognition of shared mountain roots. Back in the valley, storms swept through that winter. The Sullivan cabin, abandoned, stood battered by wind and snow. Its windows, once veiled in secrecy, now gaped empty, like eyes staring into the endless night. To some, the cabin symbolized warning, a place where silence grew poisonous. To others, it remained a scar, reminding them that tradition, when left unchallenged, could twist into darkness capable of consuming entire generations. For the surviving brothers, survival itself became victory. Each step into town, each attempt to speak, each hesitant smile marked defiance against the chains Elijah had forged. The fall of the cabin was their beginning, yet the valley was not finished with their story. Ahead lay decades of reckoning, of reflection, of legacy. Though the cabin fell silent, its shadows stretched far, touching medicine, law, and memory for years to come. Years passed after the trial, but the memory of the Sullivan family lingered in every corner of the county. The Valley of Shadows had become a cautionary tale whispered across Tennessee hillsides. Elijah served his sentence behind stone walls, writing occasional letters that revealed both regret and defiance. He insisted he had only followed family ways, yet slowly admitted he had harmed those he claimed to protect. Michael never fully escaped the weight of the past. Though he found work in small shops and later at a mill, his quiet demeanor carried an invisible scar that outsiders could never truly see. Daniel pursued education with determination. School offered him escape from the shadows, a chance to rebuild identity separate from Elijah's control. Yet even success felt heavy, as if guilt clung to his achievements. Timothy required constant care. His mind never adjusted to life beyond the cabin. Foster families struggled, but eventually he was placed in a supportive institution where structure and patience gave him fragments of peace. Meanwhile, doctors continued to study the Sullivan case. Dr. Thornton's reports traveled beyond the county, cited by genetic researchers at universities. They called it an example of generational inbreeding's toll, naming patterns after the family. By the early 1970s, medical journals across America referenced the Sullivan effect, a chilling reminder of what happens when bloodlines fold inward for too long. Their tragedy became science's evidence, a textbook written in human cost. Sheriff Caldwell, though hardened by years of service, admitted the case haunted him. He called it the silence that screamed the loudest, reminding younger deputies that cruelty often hides behind ordinary walls of poverty. The Sullivan cabin itself decayed slowly. Winters gnawed at its roof, storms shattered its shutters, vines crept over its frame. By the late 1990s, it collapsed completely, reclaimed by the forest it once defied. For townsfolk, its fall symbolized closure. Children dared each other to approach the ruins, whispering ghost stories. To elders, however, the cabin's absence left a quiet ache, proof that secrets can vanish, but never entirely die. Daniel, as an adult, spoke once at a local gathering. He described his family not as monsters, but as prisoners of isolation. "We believed the world outside wanted to erase us," he confessed. His words shifted how some saw the case. No longer just a scandal, it became an exploration of culture, poverty, and silence, forces that twisted love and loyalty until they resembled cruelty and control. Michael lived modestly until his death in the 1980s. His obituary was brief, yet those who knew him remembered kindness, resilience, and a quiet strength forged in a childhood that should have broken him. Elijah, released after serving 15 years, lived in obscurity. He tried to reconnect with his surviving brothers, but trust proved brittle. His name remained a shadow, a reminder of choices that destroyed more than himself. Timothy's life stretched into the 2000s. Though limited, he found small joys in routines, in music, in the company of caretakers who showed patience. His smile, though childlike, carried resilience born of surviving unspeakable beginnings. Academics continued dissecting the Sullivan legacy. Lectures at universities pointed to them when discussing genetics, isolation, and cultural blindness. Each time their story was reduced to data points, though for the brothers, it had been life itself. By the new millennium, the University of Tennessee established a center focused on rural health, partly inspired by cases like the Sullivans. Speakers reminded audiences, "We cannot change their past, but we can learn for others' futures." And so, the Valley of Shadows finally faded back into silence. But it was a silence no longer secret. It was history, scarred into the land, teaching future generations what happens when darkness goes unchallenged.